I want you to look at her, Monica. Just standing there like she belongs. What did Henry decide? What he should have done years ago. She walked away when he needed her most and called it principle. And the company? Mine. The house, the accounts, everything. Gavin went through the will himself. He knew I was there. That's not what the document says. Are you completely sure? That ungrateful kid gets nothing.
My stepmother said those words the way people say things they've already decided are true, not as a threat, but as an announcement. What she didn't consider was why I said nothing in return. Some things you don't correct in front of an audience. 3 days later, Peter Langford called. And the only question left wasn't whether she had won, it was whether she had ever understood what she was actually fighting for. If you've ever had someone rewrite who you are until other people believed it, stay with this story, because it ends the way those stories deserve to. And if this is your first time here, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and it means you won't miss what comes next. My father built things the way most men breathe without having to think about it, without needing anyone to tell him how. He started Carver Heritage Builders with 1 truck, 1 crew, and a reputation for doing work that held up 20 years after the last nail was driven. By the time I was old enough to ride along with him to job sites, the company had grown into something real. Not just profitable, but known. People in Tulsa trusted the Carver name on a contract the way they trusted a handshake from someone they'd known their whole lives. I grew up in the passenger seat of his pickup, watching him walk through frames and foundations like he was reading a language nobody else had been taught. He'd point at a load-bearing wall and explain why it mattered. He'd pull out a set of blueprints on the hood of the truck and trace the lines with his finger, making me follow along until I understood what I was looking at. He never once suggested that any of this was something I should leave to someone else because I was a girl. He just taught me the same way he would have taught a son, because that was who he was. My mother died when I was 23. A stroke, sudden and final, the kind that doesn't give anyone a chance to prepare. My father didn't fall apart publicly, but I watched something quiet go out of him in the months that followed. He kept working, kept showing up, kept making decisions, but the ease was gone. He moved through the days like a man carrying something heavy that he'd decided not to put down. I stayed close. I came back to the company full-time, took on more responsibility than my title suggested, and eventually became the one running day-to-day operations as director of operations while he focused on the bigger picture. The staff knew the dynamic. Most of them assumed it was only a matter of time before I took over officially. I never pushed for that. I just wanted to make sure the work was done right and that he wasn't doing it alone. Then he met Darlene Whitaker. She came into his life at exactly the moment he was most vulnerable, and I want to be honest about this. I didn't dislike her at first. She made him laugh again. She pulled him out of that heaviness I'd watched settle over him for 2 years, and when I saw the difference in him, I was genuinely grateful. I thought she was good for him. I thought the situation was simple. I was wrong about the situation, and I was wrong about her, but it took time for both of those things to become clear. The shift happened slowly enough that I kept second-guessing myself. A comment here, a question there. Darlene started asking Henry why I was involved in decisions that should be above my pay grade. She'd frame it as concern. She didn't want people to think he'd lost his edge, didn't want anyone getting the wrong idea about who was actually running the company. Henry would bring it up to me almost apologetically, and I'd explain myself, and things would settle down for a few weeks before something else surfaced. After a while, I realized the pattern wasn't accidental. Every time I demonstrated competence, it became evidence of something suspicious. Every time I spent time with Henry, it became evidence of manipulation. The most dangerous thing Darlene ever said to my father, she said so many times it became something he simply believed. That I wasn't staying close to him because I loved him, but because I expected the company to be mine and I was positioning myself to make sure it happened. She never had to prove it. She just had to say it consistently, in a tone that sounded like reluctant concern, until it felt true to a man who was grieving and tired and being told what his own daughter's motives were by the woman sleeping next to him. I left my position at Carver Heritage Builders about a year into their marriage. I thought if I removed myself from the professional equation, it would quiet the tension. I thought Darlene would have less ammunition and Henry would stop looking at me with that uncertain expression, the one that said he wasn't sure what to believe. What actually happened was that the distance I created gave Darlene more room to work. Without me in the building every day, without my presence as a counterweight, she had everything she needed to construct whatever version of me she wanted Henry to see. When the cancer diagnosis came, I found out the way you find out things you should have been told directly but weren't through a phone call from one of my father's longtime employees who assumed I already knew. Henry had been diagnosed with advanced stage cancer. The prognosis was serious. Darlene had known for 2 weeks before I heard a word. I drove to the house that same afternoon. Darlene met me at the door and told me Henry was resting and couldn't have visitors. I pointed out that I wasn't a visitor. She suggested, very calmly, that the stress of certain conversations had been affecting his recovery, and that his doctors had recommended limiting contact with people who caused him anxiety. I stood on the porch of the house I grew up in and listened to my stepmother explain why I shouldn't be allowed inside. Then I drove home, because what I wanted to do was not something that would have helped my father. Over the following weeks, I called every day. Most of the time, Darlene answered his phone and told me he was sleeping, or that he'd had a difficult morning and needed to rest, or that the doctors had adjusted his medication and he wasn't up to talking. Occasionally, I got through and heard his voice, which was thinner than I remembered, but still his. Those calls were short. He always seemed a little confused about things, about what day it was, about what we'd last spoken about. I drove out to the house repeatedly. Twice, I was turned away at the door. Once I sat in the parking lot of the hospital where he was receiving treatment for 45 minutes before Darlene came out and told me he was asleep and I should come back another time. The afternoon I finally got into his room happened because Darlene had a prior commitment she couldn't cancel. A nurse led me back, and I walked in expecting to find my father worse than I'd imagined. He was weak, yes, he'd lost weight. But when he looked up and saw me, the first thing on his face wasn't relief. It was something closer to hurt. He asked me why I hadn't come. I stood in the middle of that hospital room and heard my father ask me why I hadn't come to see him while he was sick. And I didn't know what to say first. I pulled out my phone. I showed him the call log, the dates, the times, the frequency. I scrolled to the messages I'd sent when calls weren't going through. Henry held the phone in both hands and looked at it for a long time without speaking. He wasn't confused. He was reading. And as he read, I watched his expression change into something I can only describe as a man recognizing, very quietly, that he has been lied to about something important. He didn't say much before the nurse came back in, but what he did say stayed with me, that he'd been told I called occasionally, that he'd been told I'd come by once, that he'd been told I was having a hard time handling his illness. None of it was true, and he knew in that moment that none of it was true. About 3 weeks later, Darlene left the house to have lunch with friends. My phone lit up with a number I recognized immediately. It was an old flip phone, the one my father had used for years before he upgraded, the one he'd never quite gotten around to throwing away. He'd kept it in his desk drawer, charged but unused, connected to a separate line that existed outside of everything Darlene had access to. I don't know how long he'd been holding on to it as a contingency. I don't know exactly when he decided he needed one. But when I saw that number on my screen, I already knew what it meant. I got in my car and drove to the house. He was sitting up in the chair by the bedroom window when I arrived, and he looked like a man who had been waiting to say something for a long time. He apologized first. Not in a general way, but specifically he named the things he'd believed, the things he'd repeated to himself until they felt true, the ways he'd let doubt replace what he actually knew about me. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to sit through, not because it was painful to hear, but because I could see what it was costing him to say it. Then he told me about the will. A few months earlier, Darlene had arranged a meeting with a legal consultant named Gavin Rourke. She'd told Henry they were updating some paperwork in case he needed to be hospitalized, routine documents, nothing significant. Henry had been on a heavy pain management protocol at the time. He'd signed what was put in front of him. He didn't fully understand what he'd signed until later, when he was more alert and started going back through documents he'd let pile up. One of those documents was an amendment to his will. Under the version Darlene had arranged, I was left with almost nothing. A nominal sum. Everything else, the company, the house, the investment accounts, the real estate holdings transferred to her. I wanted to act immediately. I wanted to call a lawyer, contest the document, do something visible and forceful that would put an end to what was happening. My father stopped me. He told me he had already been in contact with Peter Langford, his estate attorney of many years, through the same old phone he'd used to reach me. Peter was already working on it. Everything was being handled carefully, with documentation, with medical evaluation, with the kind of legal architecture that would hold up against any challenge. The process was almost complete. What Henry needed from me was patience and silence. He told me that if Darlene suspected anything had changed, she would escalate. She could pressure him, undermine his legal standing, find ways to complicate what he was trying to do. The only way the plan worked was if she believed she had already won. He used those exact words, "Let her think she won." I looked at my father, who was sitting in a chair by a window in the house he'd built his entire adult life inside of, and I understood what he was asking me to give up in exchange for protecting what he was trying to do. He was asking me to keep being the person Darlene had described, the ungrateful one, the absent one, the daughter who had walked away when her father needed her and could only be explained by greed. He was asking me to leave that story intact because dismantling it too early would cost us everything. I said yes. I don't know how to explain what that decision felt like from the inside other than to say it was the most deliberate thing I've ever done. It wasn't noble. It was calculated, and it was painful, and it required me to stay very quiet in rooms where people were saying things about me that weren't true. Peter Langford confirmed, without disclosing a single detail of the will itself, that Henry had met with him privately, that a physician had conducted an independent cognitive evaluation, and that everything was being formalized in a manner that would survive scrutiny. He said only one thing about my father's state of mind, and he said it clearly. Your father knows exactly what he's doing. That was enough. That had to be enough. I drove home that afternoon and sat in my kitchen for a long time without turning on any lights. I had just agreed to let my father's story about me, the one Darlene had spent 2 years writing, stand as the official version for however long it took. I had agreed to absorb whatever came next without defending myself. I had agreed to trust a man who was dying, that he had done what he said he'd done, with documents I hadn't seen, through a lawyer who wouldn't tell me anything. In time, he might not have as much of as either of us hoped. I thought about whether I'd made the right choice for a long time after I left that house. I still think about it. But every time I do, I come back to the same thing. He had asked me one direct question, and I had given him one direct answer. And after everything that had been taken from both of us, all the visits intercepted, all the calls blocked, all the distance manufactured between two people who had never wanted it, that exchange, quiet and private and witnessed by no one, was the most honest conversation we'd had in 2 years. I held on to it. I didn't have much else to hold on to after that, so I held on to it carefully. Silence, when you've chosen it deliberately, feels different from silence that's imposed on you. I had chosen mine. That distinction mattered to me in the beginning, when I could still hold on to the logic of it, that staying quiet was a form of protection, that every day I didn't respond to what Darlene was saying about me was another day my father's plan remained intact. I told myself that repeatedly, the way you repeat something when you need it to stay true under pressure. The pressure came faster than I anticipated. Darlene was methodical about it. She didn't broadcast her version of me in one dramatic moment that people might have questioned or remembered too clearly. She distributed it the way you distribute information you wanted to seem like common knowledge, casually, consistently, to the right people in the right settings. She told Henry's friends that I had pulled away the moment his diagnosis became serious, that she'd tried reaching out to me on his behalf and found me unresponsive. She told extended family members that the rift between us had been building for years, that I'd never quite accepted my father having a life that didn't revolve around me. She told people who worked at Carver Heritage Builders that I had left the company under difficult circumstances, that Henry had discovered I was trying to maneuver him into an early retirement so I could take control before he was ready to let go. Every version was slightly different depending on the audience, which is how I eventually pieced together the scope of what she was doing. But I only understood the full picture much later. In the moment, I was experiencing it from the receiving end, the phone call from a cousin who said, gently but unmistakably, that family was the kind of thing you didn't get a second chance at. The silence from former colleagues who had once copied me on everything and now didn't return calls. The careful way certain people looked at me when I was mentioned, like they'd already made up their minds and were deciding how to be polite about it. I couldn't correct any of it. That was the architecture of my situation, and it was elegant in a way I had to reluctantly acknowledge. Every time Darlene's story pushed me toward defending myself, Defending myself would have required revealing that Henry and I had spoken privately, that we had a plan, that I knew things I wasn't supposed to know. Silence looked like guilt. Silence looked like the story Darlene was telling. I understood that, and I stayed silent anyway, because the alternative was worse. What I could do was contact Peter Langford. I drove to his office and sat across from him and asked, as directly as I could manage, whether my father had completed what he'd set out to do. Peter was exactly what he'd always been: careful, measured, the kind of man who treated discretion as a professional obligation rather than a personal style. He told me he couldn't discuss the specifics of Henry's estate planning. What he could tell me was that my father had met with him multiple times without Darlene present, that an independent physician had conducted a formal evaluation of Henry's cognitive function and decision-making capacity, and that all relevant documentation had been properly executed and witnessed. He leaned forward slightly when he said the last part, and his voice was as even as everything else about him. "Your father knows exactly what he's doing." Then he stood up, which meant the meeting was over. I walked back to my car and sat there for a few minutes before starting the engine. It wasn't confirmation of anything specific, but it was enough to recalibrate enough to remind me that the silence I was keeping had a purpose, even when the purpose felt increasingly abstract against the concrete reality of what people were saying about me every day. The night I found out what Darlene actually intended to do with everything, it wasn't because I was looking for information. It was an accident, the kind that happens when someone assumes they're alone and isn't. Henry had been hospitalized again, a sudden deterioration that the medical team stabilized over several hours. Darlene had gone with him to the hospital and called me briefly to say the situation was under control and there was no need for me to come. Before she left, she'd told me by text that there were some insurance documents in Henry's office she needed retrieved and sent over, which was her way of giving me access to the house that evening without thinking twice about it. I arrived, let myself in with the key Henry had made sure I kept years ago and that Darlene had never directly addressed, and began looking for the documents in the office. The house was mostly dark. I assumed she was still at the hospital. I was moving through the hallway when I heard her voice coming from behind the closed study door. She was on the phone, and whatever she was discussing, she wasn't being quiet about it. I recognized the name she used, Gavin, the legal consultant who had facilitated the amended will. I stopped where I was. I opened the voice memo application on my phone and pressed record, holding the phone steady at my side. What I heard over the next several minutes reorganized everything I thought I understood about what was happening. Darlene was asking Gavin about contingencies specifically, what her legal exposure looked like if I decided to challenge the will after Henry died. Gavin's voice was audible enough that I could follow the shape of his reasoning even without every word. He told her that the documented estrangement between me and my father would work in her favor, that any challenge I brought would have to overcome the established narrative that the relationship had broken down independently of Darlene's involvement. She laughed at something he said. Then she told him that nobody was going to have trouble believing I'd abandoned a dying man, because by that point everyone already believed exactly that. Then she told him the plan. It wasn't complicated, but it was complete. Once Henry died, she intended to move quickly. Carver Heritage Builders would be listed with a business broker she'd already identified. The family home would go on the market within 60 days of probate clearing. Several of the investment properties would be liquidated. She was going to leave Oklahoma. She laid it out the way someone lays out a travel itinerary practically, without sentiment, with the confidence of someone who has already made the decision and is now in the execution phase. Gavin asked about me. Darlene's answer was the thing that stayed with me longest, the thing I came back to in the weeks that followed whenever I felt my resolve starting to crack. She said that by the time I understood what had happened, there wouldn't be anything left to fight over. I stood in that hallway and did not move until I heard her say goodbye, and the room went quiet. Then I found the insurance documents, walked back out through the front door, and sat in my car in the dark for a long time. Before I drove home, I forwarded the recording to Peter Langford with a single message. You should have this. What had changed was the stakes. I had understood from the beginning that Darlene wanted the money, the house, the accounts, the assets my father had spent decades accumulating. That was clear from the moment I saw the amended will. But what I hadn't understood, not fully, was that she didn't intend to hold any of it. She wasn't trying to build something with what she took. She was going to dismantle it. Carver Heritage Builders, the company my father had built from a single truck and a reputation, The company that employed people who had given 15 and 20 years of their working lives to it. She was going to hand it to a broker and take whatever the market offered and be gone before the ink dried. The craftsmen who had spent their careers building to the standard, my father demanded, the project managers who had turned down easier jobs because of what the Carver name meant, none of that factored into it. This was the thing that made everything different. I was no longer trying to protect my inheritance. I was trying to protect the thing my father had actually built, which was not a balance sheet but a body of work, a standard, a set of obligations to people who had trusted the Carver name with their careers. Darlene intended to erase all of it. And she was using the story she'd constructed about me, the ungrateful daughter, the one who'd walked away, as the legal and social scaffolding that would make it possible. I drove home and called no one. There was no one I could call without compromising what my father was trying to do. I held what I knew and waited. Henry's condition declined through the following weeks, in the way serious illness declines, not in a straight line, but in a pattern of partial recoveries, followed by setbacks that each landed a little lower than the last. He was rarely out of bed. Our time alone was limited and unpredictable, dependent on gaps in Darlene's schedule that grew shorter as she seemed to sense. On some level, that proximity to Henry mattered now in ways it hadn't before. The house was changing around me every time I visited. Darlene had begun what she described as organizational work, going through closets, sorting rooms, preparing things she said had needed attention for a long time. I noticed which items were being set aside and which were being boxed. Some of the things being boxed had been in that house since my mother was alive. A ceramic lamp she'd bought at an estate sale, a set of linen napkins she'd embroidered herself one winter. The wedding dress, folded carefully, sealed in a box marked for donation. I found that box near the back door one afternoon and stood looking at it for longer than I should have, calculating the cost of staying quiet against the cost of saying something, deciding again that I had to hold the line. In one of the last afternoons I had alone with my father, I asked him directly if he'd been able to finish what he'd started with Peter. He was lying in bed, his hands resting on top of the blanket, and the question took a moment to reach him through the haze of medication and exhaustion. He looked at me, and I couldn't read what was behind his eyes, not evasion, not fear, something more like effort. He reached over and closed his hand around mine without speaking first. After a long moment, he asked me whether I believed he knew who I was. It was such a specific question that it stopped me. Not who I'd become or what I'd accomplished, or whether I'd turned out the way he'd hoped, but whether he knew who I was. Whether the version of me that Darlene had been circulating had replaced, in his mind, the person he had actually raised. I told him yes. He nodded once, slowly, like he'd needed to hear it confirmed before he could say what came next. He told me to trust him. That was the last real conversation we had alone. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in late October, Henry Carver died at home. Darlene was with him. I was not. She organized the funeral at Redbud Memorial Chapel with the same efficiency she'd applied to everything else. The service was appropriate and well attended, and Darlene received condolences with the practiced grief of someone who understood that this was a performance with an audience. I stood on the opposite side of the room from her for most of it, and I watched people who had known my father for decades offer their sympathies to his widow while finding reasons not to make their way over to me. The story had done its work. Some of the people in that room genuinely believed I had spent the last year of my father's life staying away from him by choice. I didn't try to correct it. I was 4 days away from a meeting at Peter Langford's office, and I had no confirmation of what that meeting would contain. I stood at my father's funeral, carrying the weight of everything. I didn't know whether Henry had finished in time, whether the documentation was complete, whether Darlene's version of the will was the one that would hold. I stood there and kept my face still and let the uncertainty sit inside me without showing it. I was near the hallway at the edge of the reception area when I saw Darlene with her sister Monica. Monica was watching me with an expression that was almost curious, the kind of look you give something you've heard about but are seeing in person for the first time. She asked Darlene something I couldn't hear from where I was standing. Darlene turned her head in my direction, and the smile that came across her face was not theatrical or exaggerated. It was small and settled, the smile of someone who has waited a long time for something to be over and is now watching it end. She said it clearly enough that I could hear every word. That ungrateful kid gets nothing. Henry made sure of it. Monica glanced at me and then back at Darlene and asked if she was sure. Darlene said that Gavin had reviewed the will himself. The confidence in her voice was absolute, not the confidence of someone hoping for a particular outcome, but of someone who considers the matter already closed. She turned away from me before she'd even finished the sentence, the way you turn away from something that no longer requires your attention. I looked at the space she'd been facing and felt, for the first time since the night in the hallway, genuinely afraid. Not of Darlene, but of the possibility that my father hadn't had enough time. That the deterioration had moved faster than Peter's process. That the documentation was incomplete or challengeable, or that some technical detail had made the whole architecture unstable. I had been holding on to his words, "Trust me," for weeks, and in that moment, those words felt very thin against the certainty I'd just heard in Darlene's voice. My phone rang that evening, a few hours after the service. The number was Peter Langford's direct line. He told me my father had left instructions for me and asked me to come to his office on Monday morning at 9 o'clock. He didn't explain anything further. He didn't need to. I said I'd be there, and he said goodnight, and the call ended. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after. Whatever Monday morning held, I couldn't know yet. What I knew was that my father had made a call from an old phone to a lawyer he trusted, and then to me, and that all of it had happened in the time he had left. I knew that he had looked at me on a Tuesday afternoon in his bedroom and chosen, above everything else, to ask me whether I believed he knew who I was. I knew what I'd said, and I knew what he'd said back. I held all of that through the rest of that night and through the weekend that followed, because it was the only thing I had that Darlene's certainty hadn't touched. Monday morning arrived the way mornings do after sleepless weekends, not gradually, but all at once. The alarm cutting through whatever thin rest I'd managed and leaving me in a room that felt too quiet for everything it contained. I dressed carefully, not because I was trying to make an impression, but because getting dressed carefully was something I could control, and I hadn't been able to control very much for a very long time. I drove to Peter Langford's office on the east side of Tulsa and arrived 8 minutes before 9. Darlene was already in the waiting area when I walked in. She was seated with her coat folded over her lap, and Gavin Rourke was beside her, the legal consultant I'd never met in person but whose voice I'd heard coming through a closed door on the night everything clarified. He was a compact man in a good suit, the kind of professional who carries himself as though his composure is itself a legal argument. Darlene looked up when I came through the door, and what crossed her face was not surprise. It was something more like confirmation, as if my presence was a formality she'd anticipated and already accounted for. She didn't greet me. I didn't greet her. I sat down on the opposite side of the room and waited. Peter came out a few minutes later and brought us all into the conference room. It was a room I'd been in before, years earlier, when my father had revised certain business documents and wanted me present. Dark wood, good light, the kind of room that takes its weight from what gets decided inside it rather than from its furnishings. Peter sat at the head of the table and arranged his materials with the unhurried precision of a man who has done this many times and understands that the room will eventually match his pace whether it wants to or not. Gavin opened first. He placed a document on the table and positioned it toward Peter with the confidence of someone making an opening statement. He explained that Henry Carver's estate should be administered according to the most recently executed and legally valid expression of Henry's wishes, and that the document before them represented exactly that. He described it as the product of a period when Henry had been in stable condition, properly advised, and of sound mind to execute his intentions. The amended will, the one Darlene had arranged through Gavin's own office, the one Henry had signed while on heavy pain medication without fully understanding what he was signing, was, according to Gavin, the document that should govern everything that followed. Peter looked at the document. He didn't pick it up. He looked at it the way you look at something you've been expecting to see and have already prepared for. Then he reached into the folder in front of him and set a sealed envelope on the table, not dramatically, just placed it there with one hand and said, in a voice that carried no particular weight and needed none, "That document does not represent Henry Carver's final wishes." Darlene's expression shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible. The composure didn't leave her face, but something behind it changed the settled certainty she'd worn through the funeral and through every version of the story she'd told about me over the past year. It didn't collapse. It just, for the first time, looked like it was working to stay in place. Peter explained what had happened after Henry reviewed the documents he'd signed during his medicated period and understood what they contained. Henry had contacted Peter through a private line outside of the household network, outside of anything Darlene could monitor, and asked him to come in person. They had met several times over the weeks that followed. Henry had requested that his estate be restructured in its entirety, and he had requested that the process be documented in a way that would withstand any challenge. Peter had arranged for an independent physician to conduct a formal evaluation of Henry's cognitive function. The evaluation covered his capacity to make decisions, his understanding of the value and nature of his assets, and his recognition of who held legal standing in relation to his estate. Henry had been assessed across multiple sessions. The results were unambiguous. 2 independent witnesses had been present for the signing of the final documents. The previous will had been formally revoked. Gavin started to speak. Peter held up one hand briefly and continued. He told them the file also contained additional material submitted by a third party in the days prior, a recorded conversation between Darlene and Gavin's own office, captured on the evening of Henry's second hospitalization, in which the intended disposition of the estate assets was discussed in considerable detail. Peter set the file in the center of the table without elaborating further. Gavin looked at it. Whatever he was calculating behind his composed expression, it was happening quickly. The new will, Peter said, specified the following. Darlene Whitaker would receive a fixed monetary sum, the right to remain in the family home for a period of 6 months following probate, and certain personal items Henry had designated for her specifically. Then Peter turned to the section of the document that covered Carver Heritage Builders, and he read it without inflection, without editorializing, without anything except the plain language my father had chosen. 100% of ownership and all associated rights in Carver Heritage Builders were to pass to Audrey Carver. I heard it and felt nothing for a moment, not relief, not satisfaction. Not the particular release you might expect after more than a year of holding a position no one could see. What I felt was closer to stillness. Like something that had been vibrating at a frequency just below awareness had finally gone quiet, Peter continued. Following the conclusion of the 6-month residential period, the family home in Jenks would transfer to me. The primary investment properties would transfer to me. The majority of the financial accounts would transfer to me. All personal belongings that had belonged to my mother were to be identified, cataloged, and returned to me in their entirety. Darlene stood up. She said Henry had not been in a condition to make these decisions, that his judgment had been compromised by his illness and by medication, that the document Peter was reading from was the product of a man who hadn't known what he was doing. Her voice was controlled, but the control was effortful in a way it hadn't been before. Gavin told Peter they would be contesting the will, that they had grounds, that the evaluation process Peter had described would not hold up against proper legal scrutiny. Peter looked at both of them and said 3 words. Henry expected that. Then he picked up a remote control from the table, pointed it at the screen mounted on the wall at the far end of the room, and pressed play. My father appeared on the screen. He was sitting in the wingback chair from his study, the one he'd moved into the bedroom during the last months because it was easier for him to sit upright in than anything else. He was wearing a collared shirt. He had lost weight, and the shirt showed it, but his posture was straight and his eyes were clear in a way that was immediately, unmistakably distinct from the medicated haze I'd sometimes encountered during hospital visits. He looked directly into the camera with the same steadiness he'd used to look at job sites, at blueprints, at problems he had decided to solve. He stated his name. He said he was recording voluntarily because he anticipated that questions would arise about his decision to change his will, and he wanted those questions answered in his own words rather than through interpretation or inference. He said he had believed, for a period of time, that his daughter had chosen to withdraw from his life after his diagnosis. He said he'd been told she rarely called, that her visits had been infrequent, that the distance between them was her choice and reflected how she felt about him. He said he had believed this because it was told to him repeatedly, by someone he trusted, during a period when his own ability to verify information had been significantly limited by illness and treatment. He said this without anger in his voice, without the editorial weight of accusation. He just said it, factually, the way he described everything. Then he said what he had discovered. He had found, when he was well enough to review his own phone records and to ask questions he should have asked sooner, that his daughter had called him dozens of times during the period he'd been told she was absent. He had learned that she had come to the house multiple times and not been permitted to see him. He had found messages that had not been passed along and correspondence that had not reached him. He laid it out in the same order he'd laid out everything else, without embellishment, without performance, with the precision of a man describing conditions in a structure he'd been hired to assess. Then my father looked directly into the camera and said the sentence that Darlene had spent more than a year making impossible to say in public. My daughter did not abandon me. I had known it was true. I had lived inside the truth of it for months while watching everyone around me operate on the version Darlene had constructed. Hearing my father say it on a screen in that conference room, in his own voice, in a recording he had made, knowing he might not be alive to say it in person, that was different from knowing it. It moved through me in a way I hadn't anticipated, starting somewhere in my chest and staying there. He continued speaking. He said I had been kept away from him and that he had been guided toward the belief that the distance was my choice. He said he took responsibility for not questioning that more rigorously while he still had the capacity to do so. He said there were things he should have asked and didn't, things he should have verified and accepted on faith instead, and that the consequences of those failures had fallen on someone who hadn't deserved them. Then he explained his decision about the company, and this was the part that I had not anticipated, not because I didn't know what the will said, but because I hadn't heard him say it before in those terms. He said he was leaving Carver Heritage Builders to me not because I was his daughter and inheritance followed bloodline, but because I had spent nearly 20 years demonstrating that I understood what the company was and what it was supposed to be. He talked about specific things: mornings I'd arrived at job sites before 5 a.m. while the rest of the crew was still in their trucks, situations where I'd held a difficult position with a client because the work required it, decisions I'd made to turn down contracts that would have been profitable but would have compromised the standard he'd built the company around. He had witnessed all of it. He had watched me operate inside the thing he'd created and seen that I treated it the way he treated it, not as a mechanism for generating money, but as a set of obligations to the people and the work it represented. He said, "She earned the right to protect what we built together." Darlene was not looking at the screen by that point. She was looking at the table, and whatever she was thinking was not visible on her face. Gavin had a legal pad in front of him, and he was writing on it in the focused way that means a professional is recalculating rather than reacting. Peter let the recording finish and then addressed the two of them directly. He explained the structure my father had built around his final decisions: the medical evaluations, the independent witnesses, the recorded statement, the documented evidence of what had actually occurred during the period Darlene had described as peaceful and voluntary estrangement, and the recorded conversation that had been submitted to his office prior to the meeting. He explained the specific legal provision Henry had included regarding challenges to the will. If Darlene chose to contest the document without legal merit, she risked the portion of the estate Henry had voluntarily designated for her. He said Henry had been explicit on that point. Every layer of documentation existed not only to establish the validity of his decisions, but to ensure that anyone attempting to overturn them would have to answer, in open court, for a set of facts that were now part of the public record. Gavin asked to see the full file. Peter slid it across the table and waited while Gavin read. The room was quiet for several minutes. I looked at the window. Outside, Tulsa was going about its morning traffic, the sound of something being delivered to the building across the street, the ordinary texture of a day that didn't know it was the ending of something. Gavin closed the file and spoke quietly to Darlene. I couldn't hear exactly what he said, but the shape of it was clear enough from what followed. Darlene sat with whatever he told her for a moment, and then something in her shoulders changed, a small, almost invisible shift that was the closest thing to resignation I was going to see from her. She accepted the portion Henry had left her. Not gracefully, but practically, with the efficiency of someone who has identified the best available outcome from a set of options, none of which are what she'd planned for. She didn't look at me when she stood to leave. Gavin collected his legal pad and followed her out. The door closed behind them. I sat in the conference room for a few minutes after Peter stepped out to give me space. I wasn't processing the numbers or thinking through logistics. I was sitting with the thing my father had said on that screen, that I hadn't abandoned him, said in his own voice, on a recording that would exist as long as anyone kept a copy of it. That was what he'd spent his last available energy making certain of. Not the financial architecture, not the legal provisions, not the corporate transfer, all of which mattered, but none of which was the thing. The thing was, those 6 words, recorded in a chair in his own study, addressed to no one specific, and therefore to everyone. My daughter did not abandon me. I went back to Carver Heritage Builders for the first time in weeks on a Thursday morning, about 3 weeks after the reading of the will. I parked in the same spot I'd used for years without thinking about it and walked through the entrance and into a building that had my father's name on it and now had my name on a piece of paper that said I owned it. Both of those facts were true simultaneously, and they didn't quite fit together yet. I stood outside Henry's office for a long time before I went in. The desk was still his. The chair was still positioned the way he'd kept it, slightly angled toward the window rather than straight on to the door, because he liked to look at the sky while he was thinking. I didn't sit in it. I wasn't ready for that, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. The staff learned what had happened through the normal channels that information travels in a company not through any announcement I made, but through people who had been at the will reading or who knew people who had, through the particular silence that follows a conclusion no one was entirely prepared for. Some of them came to find me in the following days. A few said nothing and simply got back to work, which I respected more than I could easily explain. 2 or 3 came specifically to tell me they were sorry for what they'd believed, that they should have asked more questions, that the story they'd been given about me hadn't added up even at the time, and they regretted not saying so. I didn't offer them absolution or its absence. I told them I understood how a story gets established when it's told consistently enough. Because I did understand it, I'd watched it happen in real time. I kept the company exactly as it was. I didn't rename it, didn't restructure it, didn't bring in outside consultants to optimize what my father had built according to someone else's metrics. What I did was implement 2 things Henry had sketched out years before and never gotten around to formalizing. The first was a vocational training program for young people who wanted to work in construction and restoration but didn't have the means or the path to formal education, a small cohort at first, structured around the actual work, paid fairly for their time. The second was an internal fund for employees dealing with serious illness in their families, the kind of sudden financial pressure that derails careers and lives, and that Henry had always wanted to do something about but had kept deferring. Both programs were named for my parents not on a plaque or a press release, but on the internal documents that governed them, the ones the people inside the company would see. Several months after the reading of the will, I was reorganizing the bottom drawers of Henry's desk work I'd been putting off because it required spending time in that chair, which I'd finally allowed myself to do when I found an envelope taped to the underside of the lowest drawer. The tape was old, and the envelope was slightly bent at one corner from however long it had been there. On the front, in my father's handwriting, were 2 words. For Audrey. There were no stock certificates inside. No property documents, no legal instruments, nothing that transferred or conveyed or designated. There was a letter, handwritten on 2 sheets of his personal stationery, the kind with his initials at the top that he'd used for correspondence since before I was born. The handwriting was uneven in places, the hand of a man writing through pain, stopping and starting, going back to correct things that had come out wrong on the first try. He wrote that he didn't know whether I would find the letter before or after the reading of the will, and that it didn't matter in terms of what he wanted to say. He wrote that he had made mistakes he couldn't fully account for, that he had accepted things he should have questioned, that he had let someone else tell him who his daughter was when he had 20 years of direct evidence available to him. He didn't apologize in large, formal language. He just described what he'd done and said it had been wrong and that he was telling me so because he couldn't leave without telling me. Then he said he knew I would take care of the company, not because I'd been given it, but because I'd been building toward it my whole working life. He said he was not worried about Carver Heritage Builders. The last line of the letter was short. It sat at the bottom of the second page with more space around it than the lines above, as if he'd written it and then decided to let it stand alone rather than follow it with anything else. He wrote, "I knew who you were the whole time. I just forgot to say it out loud." I sat in his chair, at his desk, in the office where he had made decades of decisions about what to build and how to build it and who to trust with the work, and I held the letter for a long time. Outside the window, the sky was the particular pale blue of an Oklahoma winter morning, clear and very high and very still. I wasn't thinking about Darlene. I wasn't thinking about the amended will or the conference room or the recording or any of the machinery that had produced the outcome I was now living inside. I was thinking about a pickup truck and a set of blueprints spread across a hood, and a man pointing at a line on a drawing and saying, "Follow it until you understand what you're looking at." He had known who I was the whole time. He had said so, finally, in the only way left available to him. There's something I've thought about often since that morning in his office. Darlene spent more than a year building a version of me ungrateful, cold, calculating, and she built it so thoroughly that people who had known me for years believed it without question. What she didn't account for was that my father had known me longer than anyone. And the thing about someone who truly knows you is that you don't have to defend yourself to them. You just have to wait for them to speak. My father spoke. It just took the form of a video recording and a handwritten letter and a legal file that took 3 lawyers to assemble, but he spoke. If you've ever been made to feel like the worst version of yourself by someone who needed that story to be true, I hope this one reminds you that the people who actually know you are still out there. And that sometimes the truth doesn't come loudly or quickly, but it comes. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you're here for the next one, because the best stories are the ones that stay with you long after they're done.